Okay, so now we're going to start our third day of notes, and we're going to start with the Indian empires. So around 400 BC, India started to have invaders coming in, and the first invaders were the Persians. The second were the Greeks and the Macedonians, and in this group was Alexander the Great. He invaded in 327 BC. So in 321 BC, Chandragupta Maurya claimed the throne after killing an unpopular king of the Nanda kingdom. So he expanded the kingdom northwest by 303 BCE. He had defeated the Seleucids, they were the Macedonians, who I told you had come in before, and created an empire that stretched over 2,000 miles. He created a highly bureaucratic government, dividing his empire into provinces and local districts to help control people, and created the postal system. Where else in other river civilizations did we see provinces developed?
So if you said Egypt as your answer to another area that we've talked about with provinces, you would be correct. Remember, a province is kind of like how we've broken up the United States into different states. Each one has their own governor. The map we're looking at right now is Chandragupta's conquests. He had conquered northern India, and we will see his successors conquer even more of India, making it an even larger empire.
So this handsome guy is Kautilya, and he was an advisor to the king, and he was a top advisor and proposed spying, torture, and assassinations to keep power. I guess whatever you wanted to do to stay in power, he was for it. He wrote the Arthashastra, which is the guidebook to ruling a kingdom. You're going to see next year another author like this who worked in the Middle Ages, and you'll see him around the Renaissance area.
Some of the things that he wanted the king to do would be to make sure he had food tasters to make sure he was never poisoned. And the other big one was to have 8 different bedrooms, and each bedroom would have guards, and he would randomly pick a bedroom to sleep in to make sure that he was going to be safe from assassins. An assassin would never know exactly where to look for him. So paranoia? I don't know, but I'd rather be safe than sorry.
So in 269 BCE, Ashoka comes into play, and he's the grandson of Chandragupta, and he takes power. So there's a bloody battle, and after this battle, he begins to study Buddhism, and he wanted to start to rule by its teachings. And he becomes a pacifist and wants peace to all beings. He put up rock edicts with inscriptions of his new laws of nonviolence, toleration, and fair treatment. And these were actually edicts written on rocks. Just as it says, rock edicts. They didn't have newspapers and they didn't have computers, so you had to do it somehow. So he did it in rocks, and these were passed around, or they were for people to read and see. He also built roads that made communication and travel easier and faster. He also, along these roads, built shelters that could provide shade and rest for the weary travelers, kind of like our equal to rest areas on the highways.
So pacifism, or in this case, Ashoka is a pacifist. What does that word mean? Does anyone know the definition for pacifist? Go ahead and write that in the chat. We'll give you a couple seconds. So a pacifist is someone who is against using violence. And that's what Ashoka was known for after the great bloody battle that he was involved in.
So during Ashoka's royal rule, He sent out missionaries to spread Buddhism. Remember, missionaries are people that go out, religious people. They go out and try to convert and to teach unknown people that don't know about the religion, and in this case, Buddhism. He established free hospitals and veterinary clinics because even animals had to be protected and taken care of. And he continued political unification of much of India. He was also considered the beloved of the gods.
Here we have our rock edict. So an edict is like a command or law, and these would be posted up throughout the empire. What language is this written in? Think about the language that the Aryans developed that we talked about. It is still used in India today. Anyone know what it is? And it was written in Sanskrit. Okay.
So Ashoka died in 232 BCE. He left the region with political instability and turmoil for over 500 years after his death. And in 320 CE, now we're in CE, not BCE anymore. So now we're in the Common Era. The region was again unified under a new regime.
So the map you see on the right shows the Mauryan Empire, our first Indian empire, at its height. And you can see that it takes up almost all of modern day India, just missing a few areas in the southern tip and a little bit in the east. Okay, so the Mauryan Empire was the bigger of the two empires we're going to talk about today. So the empire which rises to power is the Gupta Empire, and it lasts for around 200 years. So we're going from the Maurya Empire to the Gupta Empire.
So the Gupta Empire is run by Chandragupta, who's no relation to the other Gupta we saw when we started the slides. He took power by marrying the daughter of an influential royal family in 320 CE. Now remember, we're in CE now, so we're on the other side of 0 from BCE. So if you do a time chart, we're in CE on the right side of 0. Chandragupta's empire stretched across the central portion of modern India. His son, Samutra, expanded the empire through 40 years of conquest. And then Chandragupta II, who is Chandragupta's grandson, ruled from 375 to 415 CE. And he leads the Golden Age and expanded the empire, the trade, and the commerce of India.
So even though the Gupta Empire ends up being smaller than the Mauryan Empire, the Gupta will lead us into the Golden Age, and that's easy to remember because Gupta starts with G, Golden Age starts with G, so Gupta, Golden Age. And they also take an idea and make it their own. What's that at the bottom right-hand corner? And yes, they will also begin using a money system like the Chinese had done during the Zhou dynasty. So here we have the map of the Gupta Empire, and as you can see, it is nowhere near as large as the Mauryan Empire. The Gupta Empire really just stretched across northern India from the Indus River to the Ganges River.
Okay, so during this empire, Indian society expanded. The Hindu influence in India really expanded. Remember, most Indians were farmers. They lived in river valleys, and they farmed and herded animals, I'm sure. They had a labor tax, which was a new thing for us to hear. 1 day a month to keep up with the irrigation ditches, reservoirs, and dams, because somehow they have to support the construction and the upkeep of these things. Most of India was patriarchal. It was headed by the oldest male. Now in southern India, it was a little different. And the Tamil people, they were matriarchal, which means they followed the mother's family line. Okay, so during Gupta's reign, India experienced great advancements in thought and science as a result of the cultural interaction between the West and the East. That was all brought on by trade that was very active at this time. We'll see that in a little bit. And also, they were a peaceful society, so they weren't worried about waging war. They were more worried about bettering their lives. So they had writers, they had scientists, they had mathematics people, they had medicine, doctors. So in their literature, they actually had someone that wrote and who's referred to as the Indian Shakespeare. His name is Kalidasa. In astronomy, they had a sun-based calendar with 365 days. And by watching an eclipse, they realized that the Earth was actually round and not flat. They also realized, studying the Earth and the eclipse, that this Earth revolved around the sun. In mathematics, they were the origins of the Arabic numerals that we use today, were 0 and pi and decimal system. And with medicine, they figured out 1,000 diseases. They had 500 different medical plants that they could use. They had injections, and they may even have had plastic surgery.
And those injections weren't done with the needles we think of. They would kind of open up your skin and then put plant juice inside of you. I don't know if I would want that done to me to try to cure me of a disease.
So during the empire, they had a trade route that flourished and became known as the Silk Roads. Mostly because, well, not mostly, because the trade was between Africa, China, and the Middle East, and out of China was silk. That was their big export. So the Silk Roads were referring to the silk coming out of China. This increased trade led to the rise of the banking systems. We already saw on a slide previously that they had money, and also involved a lot of cultural diffusion. The Indian people had become the middlemen in all of this. India was the land part of this trade. So as the Indian culture spread, Hinduism spread, like to Thailand, to Cambodia, Java, and Nepal. Also along these trade routes, we had cities that were building up. And the trade route helped to build the cities, helped to build temples in the city, and fostered prosperity along the main trade routes through India. And most of the items traded from India were salt, clothes, and iron.
We also see Buddhism spread as well as a result of trade, and it will move to places like China, Korea, and eventually Japan. And like we talked about last class, we also see Buddhism split into two different sects. We have the Mahayanas, and those are the Buddhists who follow the new teachings and believe that Buddha is a god, while the Theravādas stick to the original teachings of the Buddha. So when we look at this map, we know that the silk would come out of China, and it would develop into the Silk Road. We can see the Silk Road going through northern India, also through some of the deserts near China. And those items would be taken across this land route and make it all the way to the Mediterranean. But also around India, we have what are called these spice routes. We have many different spices which would come from India, and those would go around the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal, eventually making its way to Egypt via the Red Sea, where it could be traded to Europe as well. Okay, so we're seeing our different civilizations become more and more in contact with each other, and like Mr. Russo said earlier, we're seeing a lot more cultural diffusion going on as these different groups want different goods from different places.
So Chandragupta II died in 415 CE. One of the things that they did before he died is, because they're being heavily religious, and they had monks all over the country now. The monks had to travel and so on. So in the mountainsides, they carved out what they called rock chambers. And they carved these out of the rocks of the cliffs, and they provided rooms for the monks to stay in as they traveled. And they also were big enough, some of them, to have meeting rooms. So that was just I threw that in just to show you that they were very progressive and very thoughtful, very religious, and the monks were very important. Eventually, after Chandra dies, there's new invaders that threaten from the northern portions of the empire, and over the next 100 years, the empire broke into very small kingdoms that were overrun by Central Asian nomads known as the Huns.
And these are the same Huns that we'll talk about when we get to Rome as well. So that is it for notes.